Welcome to our deep dive this time. We're going to be looking at a really interesting report about local government in Dublin.
Yeah, this is the final report from the Dublin Citizens' Assembly.
Right.
80 Dubliners who are randomly selected to look at the big question of, uh, does Dublin need a directly elected mayor?
Right. And this is such a hot topic at the moment.
Absolutely.
We're constantly hearing about it in the news. I mean, there's just a real sense that
Yeah.
people in Dublin are kind of fed up with the current setup.
Yeah, I think, and, just for context, Ireland actually ranks last in the EU for local autonomy,
Wow.
which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
So decisions that directly impact Dubliners are being made miles away.
Exactly, by people who don't necessarily understand the unique challenges facing the city.
Right. So before we get into what the Assembly recommends, can you give us a quick overview of the current system in Dublin?
Sure. So right now you have 4 local authorities in Dublin,
Okay.
each with its own mayor.
Right.
But these mayors are largely ceremonial.
Oh, really?
They don't have a lot of actual power to make big decisions.
So it's kind of like a figurehead role.
Pretty much.
I see.
They chair meetings, they represent the city at events, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty of policy and decision-making, their hands are tied.
That seems... So you've got these 4 separate entities all trying to manage a city that's facing some pretty major challenges.
Exactly. And it's not exactly a recipe for efficiency or effectiveness.
I mean, just think about the housing crisis, the traffic gridlock, the homelessness. There's no wonder people are looking for a change.
Right. And that's where the idea of a directly elected mayor, or DEM as they call it, comes in.
Someone who can actually get things done.
Yeah, someone with a clear mandate from the people who can cut through the bureaucracy and make decisions.
Okay. So how did the Assembly approach this? They didn't just pull recommendations out of thin air, did they?
No, they did their homework. They actually looked at different models of directly elected mayors from around the world.
So they were looking for inspiration and also maybe some cautionary tales.
Exactly. They wanted to see what worked, what didn't, and how different systems address the challenges of local governance.
So which cities did they look at?
Well, they considered a few different cases, but some of the key ones were Manchester, Paris, and Boston.
Interesting mix. So what stood out about Manchester?
Well, Manchester has what they call a metro mayor,
Okay.
who has significant powers over things like transportation and economic development.
So a real powerhouse.
Yeah, and they even heard from Andy Burnham, who's the current mayor of Greater Manchester.
Oh, wow.
He really emphasized the importance of a place-first approach, putting the needs of local communities ahead of national agendas.
But I imagine they also saw some potential downsides to that model.
They did. They noted, for example, that Manchester lacks a recall mechanism.
So if a mayor isn't performing well, it's difficult to remove them from office.
Exactly. It can be a bit of a gamble.
And what about Paris? What did they learn from their system?
Paris has a very interesting system called a participatory budget.
Okay, I've heard of this. Tell me more.
So basically, it gives citizens a direct say in how a portion of the city's funds are spent.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and it's something that a lot of people in Dublin found quite appealing.
I can imagine. Imagine if Dubliners could decide how millions of euros were allocated to projects in their communities.
Exactly. It could really empower people at a grassroots level.
Right. And then there's Boston, which I guess has a very different system.
Yeah, Boston has what they call a strong mayor model.
Okay. What does that entail?
So the mayor basically acts as the city's CEO,
I see.
overseeing all the departments and making major policy decisions.
So a much more centralized approach.
Yeah, and one that comes with its own set of pros and cons.
Right. So the Assembly really had a lot to consider when thinking about what kind of DEM system would work best for Dublin.
Absolutely, and it's important to remember that no single model is perfect. They recognize that Dublin needs to find its own path.
Right. Drawing inspiration from successful examples, but tailoring the approach to the city's unique context and challenges.
Precisely. It's not about simply copying and pasting. It's about adapting and innovating.
And this brings us to the heart of the matter. What powers should a Dublin DEM actually have?
This is where the Assembly got really specific, and their recommendations highlight their ambition for real change in Dublin.
So let's start with housing, which is probably the most pressing issue facing the city right now. What did the Assembly have to say about that?
They were very clear that a DEM needs significant power over housing policy. They're talking about the ability to not just build more homes, but also to tackle issues like affordability and homelessness head on.
So not just building more, but building better and ensuring those homes are accessible to the people who need them most.
Exactly. It's about taking a more holistic approach to housing, recognizing that it's not just about books and mortar, it's about people's lives.
Right. So we're talking about a pretty significant shift from the current system where a lot of the control lies with the national government.
Absolutely. The Assembly is proposing a transfer of power, giving the Dem the authority to make decisions that have a direct impact on Dubliners' lives, like setting rent controls or streamlining the development process.
But it's not just about housing, right? They also looked at other areas where a Dem could make a difference.
Yes, they recognize that many of the challenges facing Dublin are interconnected. They recommended that the Dem have influence over things like childcare and community health care.
Because what's the point of having affordable housing if you can't find childcare or access essential healthcare services in your community?
It's about creating a more joined-up approach where the mayor can address the root causes of these complex issues and create solutions that truly benefit Dubliners.
Speaking of interconnected challenges, transportation was another hot topic.
Oh, absolutely. Dublin's traffic congestion is legendary, and the current system is pretty fragmented with multiple agencies all vying for control.
So a bit of a mess.
To put it mildly, the Assembly felt strongly that a Dem should have a much more prominent role in shaping transportation policy.
So imagine a Dem who could advocate for better public transport, push for more bike lanes, or even introduce congestion charging zones to reduce traffic in the city center.
Exactly. It's about having a clear vision for how people move around the city and the power to implement that vision.
But the Assembly also recognized that Dublin doesn't exist in isolation. Any changes to transportation within the city will have a ripple effect on the surrounding counties.
Right, and they didn't want to create a situation where Dublin solves its traffic problems by simply pushing them onto neighboring areas.
So they emphasized the need for a regional approach to transportation planning.
Yes, with the Dem working collaboratively with neighboring authorities to create a system that benefits everyone.
It sounds like the Assembly was really trying to think about the bigger picture and how a Dem could not only address Dublin's internal challenges, but also represent the city's interests on a regional and even national level.
Exactly. They saw the Dem as a potential champion for Dublin, someone who could fight for the city's needs and make sure its voice is heard.
Okay, so we've talked about housing, transportation, and now education, which seems a bit unusual because that's typically seen as the domain of the national government.
Right, you want to ensure consistent standards across the country. But the Assembly ultimately felt that a Dem could play a role in localizing implementation.
So, for example, the national government would still set the curriculum, but the Dem could have a say in where new schools are built or how resources are allocated to best meet the specific needs of Dublin students.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that local context matters and that a one-size-fits-all approach to education might not work in a diverse and evolving city like Dublin.
Okay, so we've talked about housing, transportation, education. It seems like the Assembly was pretty ambitious in terms of the powers they envisioned for a Dem.
They were, and that raises a crucial question. How would all of these grand plans be funded? Because waving a magic wand and fixing Dublin's problems is going to require some serious cash.
And that leads us to the less glamorous but oh so important topic of local government finances, which we'll delve into right after a quick break. All right, so we've established that a Dublin Dem would need significant power to tackle the city's challenges. But power without resources is like a car without fuel. It's not going to get you very far. So let's talk money.
Well, the Assembly definitely didn't shy away from this thorny issue. They dove headfirst into the world of local government finance, even comparing Ireland to its European neighbors. And what they found was pretty startling.
This doesn't sound good.
It's not great. Ireland is actually at the bottom of the pack when it comes to financial autonomy for local authorities.
So what does that mean for Dublin in practical terms?
It means that Dublin's local authorities are basically stuck. They're heavily reliant on funding from the national government.
So they have to go begging for every euro.
Pretty much. They have very limited ability to raise their own revenue, which puts them at a huge disadvantage.
So they're not really in control of their own destiny.
Exactly. And the Assembly saw this as a major roadblock to creating a truly empowered Dem. You can't give someone the responsibility to fix Dublin's problems without giving them the means to do it.
So what did they propose?
Well, they took a pretty bold stance. They recommended that the Dems should have the power to change or introduce local taxes.
Whoa. Okay, that's a big one. We're talking about giving the Dem a real financial toolbox, the ability to generate revenue to fund their ambitious plans for the city.
Exactly. It's about giving Dublin more control over its own finances.
But I imagine that idea didn't go down too well with everyone.
You're right. There were definitely concerns, particularly from Dublin businesses who worried about the potential for increased taxes.
Well, no one likes the idea of paying more taxes. But I guess it comes down to a question of value. If those taxes are being used to improve the city, to make it a better place to live and work, then maybe it's a trade-off people are willing to make.
That's the key point. The Assembly recognized this tension, and they really emphasized the need for transparency and accountability when it comes to local taxation. They didn't want to give the Dem a blank check. They wanted to make sure that any new taxes were carefully considered and that the revenue was used responsibly.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, enough financial power to make a difference, but not so much that it burdens residents or stifles economic growth.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
Now, they didn't stop at taxation, did they? What about other ways to generate revenue?
Right. They also recommended that a Dem should have the ability to borrow funds.
Interesting. So this could be used for big infrastructure projects like new transport lines or affordable housing developments.
Exactly. Those kinds of projects often require significant upfront investment that might not be readily available in the city's budget.
So it's like giving them the ability to invest in Dublin's future, even if they don't have all the cash on hand right now.
But again, with safeguards in place, the Assembly was very clear that borrowing should be done responsibly. They didn't want to saddle future generations with a mountain of debt.
Right. It's about being strategic and making sure that any debts incurred are manageable and ultimately benefit the city in the long run.
Exactly. It's about thinking long-term and making smart investments.
Okay, so we've talked about powers and funding. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what a Dublin Dem system would actually look like. How would it be structured?
Well, remember, the Assembly was starting with a blank slate. They could design a system that they believed would work best for Dublin, taking inspiration from other cities, but ultimately creating something unique.
So they had to figure out how to fit a Dem into the existing structure of Dublin's local government, which is no small feat.
Right, and they had to consider how to balance different priorities like efficiency, accountability, representation.
So did they envision keeping the four existing local authorities, or would a Dem system require a more centralized approach?
They actually explored a few different options. One model focused on retaining a city and county-wide assembly with a cabinet appointed by the Dem.
So the Dem would have a team of advisors to help them run the city.
Exactly. But they also wanted to make sure that the existing local authorities still had a voice. They didn't want to completely eliminate that level of local representation.
So maybe something like a council of councils where representatives from each of the four existing areas could provide input and make sure that their community's concerns are addressed.
That was one idea, a way to balance centralized leadership with localized representation.
So the Dem would set the overall direction for the city, but those local authorities would still play a role in shaping policy and making sure that their specific needs are met.
Precisely. It's about finding that balance between a strong citywide vision and the unique needs of different communities.
But they also considered a more radical option, didn't they? Something that would completely reshape Dublin's local government.
They did. They explored the idea of scrapping the four local authorities altogether and replacing them with smaller town councils.
Wow, that would be a major shakeup. It'd be like hitting the reset button on Dublin's local government structure.
It was a bold idea, and it certainly had its supporters. The argument was that smaller town councils would be more responsive to the needs of their communities, giving residents a greater sense of ownership and control over local issues.
But wouldn't that create a lot of fragmentation? Wouldn't it be harder to coordinate citywide initiatives or to present a unified vision for Dublin?
Those were definitely concerns, and it's one of the key tensions that the Assembly had to grapple with. How do you balance the desire for local control with the need for a strong, cohesive voice for the city as a whole?
It sounds like a classic dilemma, centralization versus decentralization. Too much of one can lead to inefficiencies and a disconnect from local needs, but too much of the other can create chaos and make it difficult to get things done.
Exactly, and the Assembly didn't pretend to have all the answers. They recognized that finding the right balance would require ongoing dialogue and a willingness to adapt as the Dem system evolves.
Now, throughout all of these discussions about structure and powers, there was one group whose role was particularly uncertain, the existing councillors.
Right. What would happen to them under a Dem system? Would they be absorbed into the new structure? Would their roles be diminished? Would they even have a place at the table?
It's a tricky question, and one that I'm sure generated a lot of debate within the assembly.
Mm.
After all, these are elected officials who represent their communities. You can't just brush them aside.
The assembly really wrestled with this. They understood the importance of maintaining some level of existing local representation, but they also recognized the potential for conflict between a powerful Dem and a council that might feel threatened by this new figurehead.
So what do they ultimately decide? How do they envision the role of counselors in a Dem system?
Well, that's a great question, and one we'll dive into right after this.
So how did they square that circle? How do they bring counselors into this new world of a directly elected mayor?
Well, one of the key recommendations was that the Dems should have a cabinet, a team of advisors to help them make decisions, but they didn't want it to be just a group of handpicked insiders.
They're not just yes men and women.
Exactly.
Right.
They proposed that a majority of the cabinet members should actually be elected counselors.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like a built-in system of checks and balances. The Dem gets to choose experts to advise them, but those advisors are also accountable to the people through their elected representatives.
Right. It ensures that the cabinet has both specialized knowledge and a connection to the concerns of local communities.
It's like a bridge between the Dem and the existing council structure.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that near-tie vote on how members of a potential Dublin City and County Assembly should be chosen. Can you remind us about that?
Oh, yeah, that was a close one. It really highlighted the tension between different models of representation.
So refresh my memory. What were the options again?
Essentially, the assembly was split on whether members of this assembly should be directly elected by the people
Okay.
or chosen by their fellow councilors.
So it's a question of who gets to decide who represents them.
Exactly. And in the end, they went for a kind of hybrid model, a combination of direct elections and appointments by councilors.
So a bit of both.
Yeah, it's a compromise that reflects the complexities of this issue.
Right, because there are valid arguments on both sides.
Absolutely.
Now, this whole idea of a directly elected mayor, it's obviously a big change for Dublin, but the Assembly didn't stop there. They actually considered whether a Dublin Dem should be enshrined in the Irish Constitution.
Yeah, that's a whole other level. It's not just about changing the structure of local government. It's about potentially altering the balance of power between local and national government.
So what were the arguments for and against a constitutional amendment?
Well, on the one hand, there's the argument that it would give Dublin more autonomy, more control over its own destiny.
It would be harder for the national government to interfere in local affairs.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there's the concern that it could create a two-tiered system where Dublin has significantly more power than other parts of the country.
And that could lead to resentment or even instability.
Right. It's a delicate balance, and the Assembly was pretty divided on this issue.
Which reflects the broader debate in Ireland about the role of local government.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say all of this actually happens. Dublin gets its directly elected mayor, all the powers, the funding, the new structures. What did the Assembly have to say about actually making it a reality?
Well, they were very clear that they didn't want this report to just sit on a shelf gathering dust. They wanted action. They wanted to see their recommendations implemented.
So they put some pressure on the government.
They did. They recommended a clear timeline with specific deadlines for the government to respond and to take action.
So what were those guidelines?
They gave the government 6 months to respond to their report in detail, showing that they were taking it seriously.
Okay, and then what?
And then they urged the government to implement the necessary changes within 2 years.
So a pretty ambitious timeline.
Yeah, they weren't messing around. They recognized that change takes time, but they also wanted to make it clear that this wasn't something that could be kicked down the road indefinitely.
Right. They wanted to see real progress within a reasonable time frame.
Exactly.
Now, all of this talk about structures and powers and deadlines, it's important, but it's also kind of impersonal.
Yeah.
You know, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of bureaucracy.
Yeah, you have to remember that this is all about people. It's about creating a system that works for the citizens of Dublin.
So what did the Assembly have to say about the human side of this whole endeavor?
Well, they recognize that a Dem can't solve Dublin's problems single-handedly. They need the support and input of the people.
So it's not just about top-down decision-making.
Right. It's about fostering a culture of engagement and participation.
So what did they recommend in that regard?
Well, they actually suggested something quite radical. They proposed the creation of a permanent local citizens' assembly.
A permanent one?
Yeah.
So not just a one-off like this assembly.
Exactly. They envisioned a system where everyday people would have an ongoing role in shaping the city's future.
That's a pretty bold idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it would require a real shift in how we think about democracy.
It would, but it could also be incredibly empowering. It could give people a real sense of ownership over their city.
But let's be realistic. Not everyone has the time or the energy to participate in a citizens' assembly.
And the assembly recognized that. They emphasized the importance of clear and accessible communication from the Dem.
So no more bureaucratic jargon or convoluted explanations.
Exactly. They wanted the Dem to speak directly to the people in plain language, explaining their decisions and outlining their vision for the city.
It's about building trust and transparency.
Exactly. Making sure that people feel informed and empowered to participate in the process.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this report is a real game changer. It's a bold vision for a more democratic and engaged Dublin.
It is. And it'll be fascinating to see how the government responds and how the people of Dublin engage with these ideas.
Because ultimately the future of Dublin is in their hands.
It is. And it'll be interesting to see what they choose to do with this opportunity.
So we encourage all of you listening to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep the conversation going. The journey towards a more empowered Dublin has just begun.